Who's growing tomatoes? Who's growing lettuce? Who's growing something else in the greenhouse besides that? Good. I'm going to talk a little about a few things, some observations, some research. I'm going to focus a lot more on smaller growers. Right now in Alabama, we have a resurgence of people growing lettuce in the greenhouse. So a lot of small operations growing one house, typically, maybe two houses. But it's just the last 5 years, we probably have, I tried to count them this morning, I know of 23 growers, and half of them are new, just the last couple of years. So some of the things I'm going to share with you are sort of research-oriented, some of them are observations, and it's really going to be geared a little bit more towards smaller-sized operations, so not to ignore the large ones. But I think there's just some practical things and some other issues that you can sort of get your foot into the door with some of these things, maybe not spending quite the same amount you would put in with if you're really going sort of full board and getting all the bells and whistles and things. So, all right. You've elected to grow plants hydroponically, so that means you've got to supply all the nutrients that your crop needs through that solution. So whether they're growing in coconut bark, pine bark, whatever the media you're growing on water, you've got to supply all the nutrients. That's the key. That's why this works so well, and it also is why, growing in a situation like this, compared to production out in the field, you can well outproduce a field production for lettuce and greenhouse tomatoes 2 or 3 times what you could normally produce, and it's got to come down to proper nutrient management. 3 categories, and the reason I mention these things is one of the second questions people ask me is why do I need to apply these varying amounts of these different nutrients? How come it's a little bit more this, a little bit more this? It really comes down to the different classes of nutrients that we're providing. You can divide all the plant's nutrients that we need to grow a crop. There's 16 of them. You're going to be providing 13 of them in the nutrient solution mix that you're using. The primary macronutrients, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, these are the things the plant needs the most. And I'll show you the chart what that looks like. Second to that, things that the plant needs not quite as much as the primary macronutrients, but the secondaries, the calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So there's the second tier. Then the next tier, just as important, but you don't need as much of it, are the micronutrients: iron, boron, copper, molybdenum, zinc, copper. So those are the elements that we need in the parts per million range typically for the plant. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, those are the other 3 for the 16. But you get those from water and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So those are automatic typically with the environment and the greenhouse environment. So those are the 13 you need to apply. I think it's useful to look at a chart like this, and what we're looking at here is the relative amount of all those different nutrients actually make up in a plant. So if you take a plant, say a tomato plant, all right, harvest the whole tomato plant, roots, shoots, leaves, fruit, everything, take it and dry it down. These are the relative percentages of the different elements that will be left within that plant, and this gives you sort of an idea of why the plants need more nitrogen than they do of zinc. So when you look at nitrogen, when you dry the plant down, about 1.5% of that whole plant is actually composed of nitrogen. So that's quite a lot. So that's why we need more nitrogen than we need of all the other elements that are out there. So next, where's the laser pointer? Oh, there we go. Okay. Potassium, calcium, 1%, 0.5%, and this goes down. Then when you get to the micronutrients, chlorine, iron, boron, manganese, and things, you're talking the parts per million range, so all the way down to molybdenum and even nickel now that's pretty well widely accepted as being an essential plant nutrient, so down to 1/10 of a part per million. So this sort of gives you an idea of sort of the scale, why you need more of one thing than you need of other things. So it also form is important, so it's not just what you put out there, it's form. So just because you put something out there, you expose the plant to a particular nutrient, does not mean that it's going to be just immediately taken up by the plant. Sometimes there's got to be some microbial activity or some chemistry that occurs within the solution you're growing to actually cause that material to break down or to be converted to a form so that the plant can actually readily take up. So where does that occur? Where does the plant take most of its nutrients up? Or I should say 99.9% of them. Where's it at? Roots, right, that's right, roots. Don't be shy to say that's important. So roots. And I have sort of a pet peeve against foliar feeding, and I'll mention to you later why I sort of have a pet peeve about that. So But when it comes down to nutrients and nutrient management and hydroponics, you've got to have the nutrients around the plant roots. You can't say, well, if I run into a problem or I come short, I'm just going to spray something on the plants. That's just not the answer. So especially for the macro elements, the things that the plant needs the most of. So for NPK, calcium, magnesium for the most part, sulfur. So you just can't meet the plant's demands by simply trying to spray something on. So this has got to be around the plant roots. And so you've got to also make sure the nutrient solution is in the correct form. And it's also at the correct pH. My talk I'm giving today is sort of the part one of tomorrow's talk. So today I'm going to talk about nutrients, the importance of nutrients, some of the things management-wise. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about what happens when those things go wrong, if something ends up falling short, or you had some particular issue that goes along. So this is sort of a part one and two. And I mentioned this. So has anybody ever heard these terms before about whether an element's mobile in a plant or not? Have you ever heard that before? That's key to understanding deficiencies and toxicities very commonly. So it's something you just need to know at the back of your mind right now. So if you call me up, you say you have a particular issue out there, I may ask you to send me photos or describe what's going on. So depending on what's going on with the plant, so we go through and figure out if you actually do have a nutrient issue. But knowing how these elements move in the plant is sort of key to identifying some of those potential problems. So for elements, the primary macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the secondaries, magnesium, and sulfur, they're mobile. So they move from the oldest portion of the plant into the new portion of the plant, the growing portion of the plant. And you need to constantly resupply those things. So that's why it's important to maintain that nutrient solution you're growing the plants in. So it's important to keep it at the levels that you need to keep it in order to optimize growth, because if it runs out, I guarantee in the course of about 10 days to 2 weeks, you're going to start seeing some pretty dramatic deficiency symptoms showing up for some of these different elements. So how those things move within the plant is important, especially for diagnostics. But it's the kind of thing, if you're growing these plants, you really have to have a good understanding of. So for the microelements and for calcium, for the most part, they don't move particularly well in the plant. They will go into the plant and they will stay in the oldest portions of the plant, and the plant will have to continually take up new materials to send it to the growing points within the plant. So those elements, the micros, are immobile. They don't move particularly well. So deficiency symptoms, if you run out of a microelement, is going to start showing up in the newest growth first. So that's something just sort of to keep in the back of your mind. I think it's important to remember. It all comes down to pH, water chemistry. It's a chemistry problem when you're dealing with a nutrient solution. So for most of the crops that you grow, what you find when you start reading in the literature and you start reading research and you start talking to growers and research from I've done, for the lettuce and tomatoes, typically I'm trying to keep the pH in that 5.6 to 5.8 range, no higher, no lower than that. And I've tried research projects where I've gone higher than that, up to 6.5. You can find references in literature saying, yeah, optimal for lettuce, 6 to 6.5, and I can't say that I've had a lot of luck with that. But you can still, unfortunately, find things like that out there in literature. So everything you read may not be 100% accurate, or it could be old research. So you really have to make sure you stay up on these types of things. But for the most part, research I've done and what we find most of the growers, if we, in Alabama that I work with, if we can keep it in this 5.6 to 5.8 range, that's what this line is here. What you see here is all these different lines that come across. These are all the different elements: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. The width of those bands represents the availability at those different pHs. So a lot of times, if you're growing a field crop, I'm going to tell you you need to keep your pH someplace in the 6 to 6.5 range, which is in here. What you find is the width of those bands is fairly thick, or relatively thick, at that particular pH. At that particular band. In the case of the hydroponics, like most of the crops you're going to keep in a 5.6 to 5.8 range, you're going to find a fairly decent availability for all these elements out there. And that's why it's important to keep it at this range, because if it starts going below this, you're going to run out of nutrients. What happens is the nitrogen is still there, the phosphorus is still there, but it can get converted to forms that the plant simply cannot take up anymore. Or in the worst case scenario, you can actually get precipitates form, solids form in the solution, so you get this gunk at the bottom of your tank. That was your calcium. That's what the plant needed, and the pH got so low that the calcium reacted, so when it precipitated, it formed a solid, fell a solution, and it's a bunch of gunk at the bottom of your tank. So pH becomes critical. Also with the microelements, what happens is the pH goes lower, they actually become more available. So when I do see toxicities in the greenhouse, so the most common toxicity I typically see in greenhouse lettuce, for example, so has actually been from iron. So where the pH and the water is simply, in the solution has dropped to the point where it's actually become toxic. And I actually have a couple of pictures to show you that tomorrow. So the availability is greatly affected by pH. And this is why I tell you, you should have a pH meter. You should also have an EC meter. And you should check it every day. If you're a small grower, so we're not talking about spending a lot of money, $40 to $50 to buy a pretty decent pH meter. So, and the same thing for an EC meter. You can get combo meters and things like that. The other thing is if you have a pH meter or an EC meter at this point, does anybody know what a pH meter is now? You're measuring right? So, and an EC meter, I'll show you a picture of those that measures the electrical conductivity. It's the strength or the dissolved salts in that particular solution. It's one way of measuring the strength of the solution that you're dealing with, of the nutrient solution you're dealing with. So they have to be calibrated if you've got one. So just don't assume it's going to be working every year from season to season. So, because it's very easy, typically we throw them in the greenhouse, we stick them on a shelf, and they sit there, and if they're not working, and it's not hard for them to get screwed up. So, and you might be made to just simply buy a new one, or you need to get it, you need to have it calibrated, which is not a particularly hard thing to do, but it's just one of those things you've got to do every year or two, so to make sure that the equipment's operating. All right. So when you look at the literature, and you look at research, and you look at production guides from around, not just here, but up from Europe and Asia and other places like that, the typical fault range you're going to find for most crops, even though a lot of crops are remarkably tolerant on the higher end up to 7, you're just not going to get ideal growth at that point. So that slightly acid or moderately acid solution is really what you're shooting for. For tomatoes, I tell our growers, you're shooting for that 5.6 to 5.8 range, trying to keep it in that particular range. And for lettuce in our flow beds, we have a lot of flow beds. And if you don't know what a flow bed is, I will show you a couple of pictures of lettuce and flow beds. That's what you're seeing is the top side of the flow bed. These are in foam, growing on top of foam mats or floating on top of the bed inside of the greenhouse. So, but we try to keep the pH in that 5.6 to 6 range, preferably in the 5.8 range. So for NFT as well as for tomatoes. So keeping it in that moderately acid range is going to help the availability of all those nutrients that you're putting out there. So if it goes lower than this, you're going to have a problem. This is in a perfect situation. So there's certainly situations, unfortunately, and I'll show you, you may actually have to treat the water that you're actually providing to your plants. So if you have to do that, it's very doable, but it's the kind of thing you may need to figure out ahead of time before you actually go out and try to start growing these crops. So there's a lot of things you can do to correct it. I said before, and I think it's certainly worth pointing out, so this time of the year, for some reason or other, when we're growing in pine bark, or when we're growing our tomatoes in pine bark, for several of our growers around the state, I will always see magnesium deficiency pop up. Starts off with this intraveinal chlorosis on the lower leaves of the plant. So every year, about this time, February, March, so obviously there's some environmental component out there as well, so our light levels, so will show up. So the grower will first ask me, should I just spray some Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate on there? So, and I tried some research, and honestly, I get more effect if I drench the plants, if they're growing like in pine bark or simple, containers like in tomato buckets with perlite or peat kind of material. So I get a better effect within a course of 5 or 6 days if I drench those plants as opposed to trying to spray it on. It's hard to get enough magnesium to go through the plant leaves to actually meet the plant's demand. That's when you really run into a problem. That's sort of my pet peeve with foliar feeding. It's just not very effective for the macro elements. So it's hard to get enough NPK across that plant leaf to actually meet the plant's demand. With nitrogen, you can get your plants to green up very quickly if you spray them with nitrogen, but it's a very short-lived effect. So you're not treating the underlying problem. So hopefully it's not a pH problem. So, but you've really got to sort of pay attention to that. All right, so obviously keeping the pH of the solution is critical. So one thing with tomatoes that I've found sort of helpful for growers that are just starting out, they have one house, it's 96 by 30, so and they tend to look at things fairly simply. They're not putting in a very complicated system. They have a couple of injectors, they're growing in tomato buckets, or they're growing in nursery bags, they're growing either in coconut coir, or maybe they're growing in composted pine bark, aged pine bark, so they work real well. The systems are usually open. You're not recirculating. Every time you go to provide nutrients, or every time you go to provide water, you provide nutrients at the same time. So you're spoon feeding the plants. Every time you irrigate, you're also providing a little bit of nutrients. And you can follow that on a set schedule. I'll show you what one of those looks like. And I say the pH is usually not difficult to maintain. That's provided the water you're starting with is actually in good shape. So it's doesn't have a pH of 7.4, and you've got to add acid to it, or you've got some other problems, a lot of dissolved minerals or something like that in the water. So getting your water tested is actually a good idea. Most states labs that do soil analysis and things like that, you can send a sample in for its suitability for irrigation for vegetables, or for growing greenhouse vegetables, or for growing plants in general. So you can come back, it'll give you an idea of the hardness of the water, the pH, it'll tell you what's in there, if you have a lot of iron or copper or some other particular issues you may have to deal with. And obviously very importantly is the pH. In Alabama, in certain areas in Alabama, especially on the western side of Alabama and in the extreme southeastern corner of Alabama, we have wells that'll go 400 to 500 feet down, and the pH in those wells is almost always above 7.3, 7.4, 7.5. And for operations that grow in a greenhouse, they all have to acidify the water typically before they actually inject their fertilizer and then provide it out to the plant. So it's one of the things you can do, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. For the float beds and lettuce, typically, the float beds, if you're all familiar with float beds, are usually 6 to 8 inches deep, so it's a large pool. And again, I've got some pictures out there, and NFT, nutrient film technique, this has been, at least right now in Alabama, it's pretty evenly divided in terms of operations, putting one or the other in. So there's certainly a lot more startup costs associated with putting NFT in. So because you're buying individual channels and a frame, whereas a float bed, you're typically buying or designing a platform that's going to fit half of your greenhouse out there. So you're putting in a liner, so that's usually probably the most expensive part of it. Then you're filling it with a nutrient solution, and you're sticking your crop on top of it. So it's pretty straightforward. And I think that's what's so attractive to some growers. It's got some downsides as well as upsides. And so does NFT for that matter. So there's two systems, but in terms of the pH, so that between keeping it in that 5.6 to 5.8 range is really ideal. Most of the growers, when they're first starting out, usually these are closed systems. You've just got a bed. You're not mixing up nutrient solution every day, so it's recirculating either in the NFT. So you've got a big tank out there that's storing the solution. You turn the system on, and it's taking the water from this tank and it's putting it through your NFT channels. Or you've just got a solid bed out there, a pool of this stuff that you're going to circulate periodically during the day, so for 12 hours a day, depending on what you're doing. So, in this particular case, pH becomes even more important. So one of those things you've got to make sure that you check daily. So because in these float beds, especially as the plants begin to grow and really develop, so pH can really begin to fluctuate greatly, and it's going to tend to become more acidic over time. And if you really want to keep the plants growing ideally, so keep the environment well and the pH where it needs to be, you have to adjust the pH. So it may be a daily occurrence. You can do this by hand, which a lot of the growers right now in the state, in Alabama, do by hand. There's a few systems that have automated systems that will tweak it for you. That's certainly nice and it's great, but it's also obviously a cost associated with that. It's the kind of thing, like I said, I'll tell growers, it's the kind of thing you can grow into. So, you can ultimately make your system more complicated, add different levels in it, and it's going to really help tweak the production and really help optimize the growth, because the pH is going to stay optimal all the time as opposed to any fluctuations that might be out there, because you may only check, maybe only alter the pH every other day or in a couple of days, or you may not worry about it at all. So growth tends to fall off as the pH becomes less desirable. So the more you can do to sort of keep it right in the range it needs to be, you're going to tend to get much more even growth. In a greenhouse, if I had to pick the one thing that I tell growers, that despite that fact that they may do it anyway, is you should not be using the same solution that you use for your lettuce and leafy greens that you use for your tomatoes. Two different concentrations, different strengths. Typically with tomatoes, we're stair-stepping. We're increasing the rate of fertility as it puts on more flower clusters and more fruit. So you're increasing it, so it's very small starting out, then as the crop goes on, and I'll show you a chart of what this looks like. So you're increasing the amount of fertilizer you're putting out, each time. So it's a lot of nutrients, it's a lot of nitrogen to be trying to expose to a crop like that is going to, it's going to be exposed to a crop like lettuce. So the lettuce simply doesn't need that much nitrogen. So what you end up doing is you end up over-fertilizing the lettuce, or it's not very effective. It's that you're wasting a lot of nutrients. You're putting out more than the plants actually need. So it's really a problem more in terms of economics, because you're simply wasting nutrients if you overwater on a regular basis, if you over-fertilize on a regular basis. For tomatoes, most growers use timers. And when someone asks me, well, what's the magic number? How often should I irrigate my tomatoes? And unfortunately, the answer to that is, well, as often as they need it. That may sound like a disingenuous answer or maybe an ambiguous answer, but that's really the truth. On a day like today, it's very overcast, you may only need to water your plants a few times, 3 or 4 times a day, maybe less, maybe more, maybe depending on what the temperatures are in the greenhouse. So, or as if it was a day like yesterday where we had a lot of good sunlight, it was pretty sunny in this area, so you may need to irrigate them 12 times a day. So this is one of those things that, this is where when a grower talks about having a greenhouse operation that he's just supplementing his income with, he's already got a full-time job. This is one of those situations where you've got to be able to find the time to get out there in your greenhouse every day, observe the plants, see what's going on, and really making sure you're getting out there what you actually need to get out there. So you have to go out there and observe it and see really what the plants need. Do I need to irrigate longer? Is the duration of my irrigation sufficient to make sure that I actually wet that entire soil profile? So that's really important. So the timers work great, and obviously it's a whole lot easier to put the system on a timer than it is to have to go out there several times a day to see if you need to irrigate. So, but obviously timers aren't very smart. So they're only going to do what you tell them to do. So you may overwater or underwater. So it's one of those things you really have to get out there, and as the plants mature, you've got to make sure you're getting out there what you need. And most growers are going to be on the fairly liberal side of things, and they're going to overestimate as opposed to underestimate. But again, that does tend to waste some nutrient solutions. So the other thing you can do is you can use a solar sensor. They're still out there here and there, and solar sensors, they collect information on sunlight and the quality of sunlight. So the premise basically is that as the solar sensor collects sunlight, it's going to give the computer an idea. It's a measurement of basically how ideal the growing environment is. Are we getting enough light out there that my plants are going to be growing, and are they going to need irrigation? So a solar sensor is a way to manage your irrigation system. So it's a way to make sure you're putting out nutrients in a situation where it's cloudy today. The solar sensor is going to say, light quality is pretty poor, I'm not accumulating a lot of sunlight here, so I'm not going to irrigate very often. So but on a sunny day, obviously, it's going to collect that information saying, hey, I've been getting a lot of sunlight, we're going to need to irrigate now, maybe a couple hours later, time to irrigate again. So it's going to help maintain that environment and really keep the soil moisture, the moisture of the media you're growing your tomatoes in ideal. So typically they're located in the top portions of the greenhouse, away from any obstructions, because you don't want any shading or anything like that. So, but it's a nice way to do it. So if you get one. So I've tried a lot of different formulations out there. There are a lot of recipes you can follow, and a lot of people say, well, what's the difference? What you really find when you start looking at the nuts and bolts of it, so you're going to find ranges. You're going to find fairly similar ranges, in terms of the actual parts per million or percentages of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, and things like that. So what you typically find are recipes, basically, they're getting to that same point. They're actually, for the most part, they tend to be within the ballpark of each other. There's a lot of them out there. There's several very good ones in Rick's handbook for the Greenhouse Tomato Production Guide in the back of it. So there's some very good formulas. But when you start comparing them on a case-by-case basis, you don't see a lot of, at least I haven't seen, of the couple of dozen formulations I played around with. They're very similar. I got very similar yields. I didn't see a lot of difference. So one thing, so that's when you start making them up by yourself. So, and it's a fun thing to do, and if you're into chemistry, you can collect all those materials, do all that. But for most of the smaller operations, it's so much easier to buy premixed material. There's plenty of good formulations out there that are specifically designed to be sort of the basis of your nutrition for my tomato crop. Companies like Hydro Garden sells a version of it. So Grower Supply sells one, and there's several other companies out there that make them, and I've done some comparative stuff just looking at them, so sort of balancing everything out, making sure that everything's getting relatively the same amount of nutrients, and I get similar yields. I don't see a lot of difference in these premixes, and the premixes typically, they'll be, in tomatoes, they'll be, basically a tank A that's going to have part of your that's what you're sort of seeing here. You're going to have sort of a tank A, that's going to have a premix, plus maybe some Epsom salts at some point, going into the production cycle. So then you're going to have another tank, sort of your tank B. That's going to have everything else in it. So calcium nitrate, potassium nitrate. With greenhouse vegetables, you use primarily nitrate forms of nitrogen. So you don't want to use, with the exception of ammonium nitrate, you wouldn't want to use much of that, or maybe 0.5% of that in total. So that I played with it, I don't see a lot of problems. But the greenhouse vegetables definitely have a preference for the nitrate forms of nitrogen, and they grow better. So when you start growing the plant with too much of ammoniacal nitrogen, tomatoes, they get brittle. They'll get really dark green, and they don't produce like they normally should. So these premixes, typically, you'll have one premix in one tank, then you'll have the calcium and potassium nitrates in this other tank. So and you're off and running. So the premixes sort of make things a little bit easier, less likely to really cause problems when you try to mix these things up yourself. So the complexity of the irrigation system you use, it really depends on what you got to start with. Very simple systems that are basically using 2 or 3 dosatrons with a couple of bulk bin buckets, these 30-gallon drums, or you can get trash cans. Those work just as well. So this is pretty low tech. You've got a timer, turns your system on, so it's got a timer with a solenoid, so it's going to start the flow of water. So then every time you irrigate, so it's going to pull out of tank A, it's going to pull out of tank B, and in this case they added another one because their pH of the water coming in was 7.5. So they needed to acidify the water somewhat to lower the pH, get it closer to neutral before they added these other fertilizer materials. So it's a problem depending on where you're located, at least in Alabama, so I'm sure in Mississippi and other states. So this is a pretty simple system. So there's not a lot of sophistication here. So the grower has to come through with his pH meter and his EC meter, check those periodically of the solution that's coming out from these mixes. So like I said, it's pretty straightforward, and premixes to me really make sense. It really, for a small grower, it may be a couple more dollars here and there. So frankly, when it comes down to it, you're less likely to really have a major problem because you forgot something or you accidentally. The worst situation I think I've ever seen was simply the grower confusing grams with ounces. So not following. So his scale was measuring grams. He was supposed to be measuring ounces. So he put in way more fertilizer than he needed to. So in his situation, it hurt him more in his pocketbook. So because unfortunately it showed up pretty quickly in his plants that there was a real problem. So there's certain little things you can do. But when these premixes, like I said, really do make things easier. I'm not trying to sell anyone in particular, but they really do make things a lot easier, especially for small growers. Otherwise, you're having to buy a lot of individual components, and sourcing them locally sometimes can be quite a challenge. And all these things you've got to ship. So you're paying weight. You're paying to move, something that could be 50 or 60 pounds or more, per bag, to yourself. So anything you can do to sort of reduce that, I think, is sort of beneficial. So. Again, the level of complexity, from that basic system here with the timer, a solenoid valve, the 3 injectors. So, these Dosamatic or Dosatrons are $300 or $400 a piece. They're great workhorses. They're hydraulic. You don't need power for them. There are powered injectors like this one, so you can get power injectors. This is a system from Crop King for a lettuce grower down the street from me. So it monitors everything, EC, pH, it tweaks the solution, keeps everything exactly where it needs to be. But there's a serious cost, and for small growers just getting into this can be really challenging, for them. So, you're already spending $20,000 for a greenhouse structure. So, not that you need to skimp on anything, but I think there's some bare bones things you can get, pay for, and not, and work towards more automated systems later on. So I think there's some trade-offs. Like I said, is one better than the other? Yeah, anything you could do to tweak that solution frequently, keep everything optimal levels, that's going to give you your best growth in the long term. So, but, as a small grower just getting started with one single house, yeah, this works. Just having those 3 containers and having this basic basic structure here works just fine. So, and they're able to grow a good sellable tomato crop with it. So, is he optimizing his production? No. So, because he's, but he's coming pretty close and he's doing pretty well. So, and again, it's the kind of thing you can really work into. So that's why I think a lot of our growers that I've been work with, they'll start out with these fairly basic systems, and they'll, with the idea of graduating to something different later on. But that does give you a lot of options. So, all right. Tomatoes, again, typically you're trying to keep the pH in that 5.6 to 5.8 range. EC, everyone, we talk about EC meters, so, but these are not a catch-all. This is just simply a way to take wholesale measurements. So this is not a fine implement. It's not going to be able to tell you all the individual ions or different critters, the different nutrients that are actually in your solution. It's a bulk measurement. It's going to be a measure of all the dissolved salts, all the dissolved fertilizers in that solution. So one thing that I think, too, you need to do, don't forget, is to measure the EC of the litter coming in. So you have to take that into account when you're actually measuring the EC of your final solution. So this is a gross measurement. So, but it's not something, like I said, you want to take, if you're absolutely concerned about it, there's other ways you can sort of find out what's going on with the individual elements in your nutrient solution. So, and also, in the case of tomatoes, you're pretty well mixing up a new batch every time you irrigate. So, and hopefully, unless you've got a lot of problems with like evaporation, like if you don't cover your tanks here, you get quite a bit of evaporation, and as this evaporates, you're going to concentrate the fertilizer salts that are in there, and it's going to cause an increase in the EC. So evaporation can cause the EC to go up, as well as just increase the amount of nutrients that you're putting in there. So it's one of those things you need to be cognizant of. So, and it's important that, I tell growers, make sure you seal them up. So it's important to have a nice tight seal on these things, so you don't lose a lot of water due to evaporation, and it doesn't alter the EC of greatly alter the EC of these bulk solutions you're dealing with. So, but EC meters, like I said, don't distinguish between several ions. So if you've got a problem out there, if your EC's been fairly stable going along, but you're suspecting a nutrient solution problem, and you're getting the same EC reading, it may still be a nutrient issue. And like you said, the problem is the EC meter simply does not distinguish between the individual elements, but there's a way you can figure that out. So I'll talk about leaf tissue sampling tomorrow a little bit, but one of the other things you can do is you can actually take that nutrient solution, take a sample of it, send it into your state lab, and tell them to run an ICAP. That's going to give you basically all the elements except nitrogen. It's going to tell you the percentage or the parts per million of all those different elements that are in there. So the potassium, phosphorus, calcium, everything. So everything you put into your bulk tanks, they come out at the end of it after they go through the injectors, is predictable. You can actually sit there based on the math that's in the back of Rick's book. So you should be able to predict the parts per million of nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus and all those other elements that you put in there are mixed, so it's predictable. So what you can actually do is you can send a sample off to that soils lab, tell them to run ICAP plus nitrogen to get a total. You can have actually, to get an idea of the amount of nitrogen in there. You can also have it sort of segmented out in terms of the amount of nitrate or ammonium nitrate and things like that. So, and all that's really useful information. So you get a report back. So if you suspect a nutrient thing, and that's going to give you confirmation whether there's a problem with it or there's not a problem with it. Personally, I think if you're a grower just starting out, using leaf tissue analysis is a way to figure out what's going on in the plant. Using the ICAP for the solution is going to tell you what's going on with the solution. So if there's a problem someplace in between, that's going to help me identify where the issue might be. But it's a way to check your homework, check your math work, make sure you're actually absolutely where you need to be. So, and it'll give you the EC. But again, EC gives you all the dissolved salts that are in that solution, not just individual. So if you suspect a problem or if you really want to confirm what's going on, that's the way to go. So it's a way to do it, to get some answers. PC and EC are also affected by temperature. So checking them every day at the same time or getting the temperature, that can make a difference as well. So you want to sort of, when you do take those readings, you want to make sure that you sort of take note of that. The other thing is get a pH meter or EC meter that compensates for temperature or that can negate the effect of temperature when you actually take those measurements and things like that. So that there's ways you can sort of work around that. Does everybody understand that? I know that's probably more math and science kind of stuff than you want to talk about, but yeah.
I wanted to mention too, one of the important things is calibrating under the temperature that you're going to be operating that probe in.
That's right. Yeah, so calibration is key to keeping these EC and the pH meter working correctly. So some can compensate for temperature, so, but calibration under this, specific temperatures is certainly key. So, if you have a problem calibrating them, or you're not sure how to do it, you can call up to companies where you got it. My State Soils Lab, you can actually take your EC meter or PC meter, pH meter, bring it in, and they'll actually calibrate it for you. They'll do a 2-point calibration for the pH meter, and they'll do one for the EC meter as well. So there is help out there if you're concerned, if you're not quite sure about how to follow that. So these are all tools that you've got out there. The pH meter, the EC meter, they're tools, but they're not always going to give you the absolute view of what's going on. So sometimes you've got to look another level, a little bit lower, to really see what's going on. So, all right. This is a fertility program we've been recommending from Auburn. So this is based on work that was done at the University of Arizona back in the 60s through the 70s by sort of a grandfather of hydroponics, Merle Jensen. So he did a lot of very significant groundbreaking work on hydroponics, flow bed systems as well. So but Merle's recipe that was out there, and this is basically the translation of it. So the practical upshot of it for tomato growers. So you've got tank A, you've got tank B. Tank A, we have like a 315-27, which is a tomato blend. Like again, you can talk to companies out there like Hydro Gardens, others, get their tomato recipe. And then with that, typically, we've got to add some magnesium sulfate. Once the plants get up, usually in that 3rd cluster or 5th cluster range, then in the second tank, calcium and potassium nitrate, and we begin increasing the rates of those things as we go along. Basic starting point, where a lot of growers will typically start with. So this is, again, like I said, this is a formulation that's been around for almost 40 years, probably more or less. It's been tweaked a little bit here and there. We've sort of advanced some of this and added a little bit more here and there we found through research. When it comes down to it, whether you're going to advance it, maybe the plants are growing a little more vigorously than the others were. So, this is not a strict number, transplanting the first cluster. We may advance this a little bit, if the plants are developing more quickly, growing more quickly, or we've got a larger fruit load. And the way we tweak it is by foliar analysis. So, every 10 days to 14 days, so every, 2 weeks or so, we'll take a sample of the leaves. It goes off to the lab, and then it's going to print out and say how much NPK, calcium, magnesium, etc. is in those leaves, and we know what the sufficiency range is for. The nice thing is that foliar analysis, we have ranges established for almost all vegetable crops, that are out there. In the case of the tomatoes, we have really good numbers. So we even have good numbers now for heirlooms grown in the greenhouse. So from research that's been done around the state, and they're actually a little bit different from the typical beefsteaks and others that we grow in the greenhouse. So these are pretty good places to start, but again, tweaking it or altering it, that's where we end up with the foliar analysis and such. All right, a couple of quick things about lettuce. So about especially some of those smaller growers, this is a float bed system, so in a greenhouse. So this is a pretty typical system which you find in Alabama right now. So they're growing them on these floating mats. These beds are about 6 to 8 inches deep, and they're filled with your nutrient solution that you're using. So it's a nice way to get into it. It takes up a lot of square footage in your greenhouse. And when it comes to a greenhouse, you want to keep as much of the square footage busy as possible. So this is a real good way to really occupy square footage out in the greenhouse. Typically, though, with lettuce, since it's a fairly short cycle crop, ideally it'd be great if we could get our lettuce out in 30 days or 30, 35 days, but that doesn't always happen. And quite frankly, with float beds, it tends to stretch it out a little bit. It takes a bit longer in our float beds to actually get a mature head than it does in the NFT system. So it's a shorter cycle crop. Typically, we might use 2 different strengths. We'll use like a quarter strength solution when the plants are small, seedlings, before we put those little plugs into these trays, or into the NFT system. So this is a typical NFT system. So where each of the little plants are going into these little plug holes, and this is actually one where I've done some research looking at, I can compare side by side 4 different nutrient solutions. So in this little setup, so it's a way to compare a lot of things very quickly with lettuce. So, but most of the time, most of the recommendations you find out there is since it's a fairly short cycle crop, is to replace the nutrient solution. So mix it up once, dump out my beds or dump out the tanks, and then put new solution in. That's an easy way to do it, but really when it comes down to it, it's really not the most effective way to use the nutrients that are in there. The second question really comes in some states is where do you put it? You know, you've got a solution out there that's not depleted completely of nutrients. Do you just put it outside? Do you dump it someplace? Do you put it on the lawn? What do you do with it? So there's certainly that sort of issue, but if you're just trying to do a shortcut, well, not a shortcut, maybe a quicker way and not so complicated, a lot of growers do this, and it works. So they monitor the pH and EC, but they don't do a lot with it. They just simply replace that solution every 2 weeks, and they go from there. So it's like I said, it's fairly straightforward, pretty easy. So there's a lot of good premixes out there for lettuce, and I'll show you what a formulation sort of looks like that we've been recommending in Auburn. So a couple things though that I think is important to note is with NFT and flow beds, I've looked at circulating these things 24/7, and frankly, running them 12 hours a day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., basically during daylight hours in the southeast is usually sufficient. So I haven't had issues like with, with crop damage or anything like that, so by running the system 24/7, so I basically haven't needed to do that. So with flow beds, a lot of people say I need to run my beds 24/7 because I'm worried about low oxygen, but frankly, with a fairly shallow pool like that, and as long as the water's circulated, periodically during the day, I've never seen a problem with low oxygen. You can measure dissolved oxygen in there, but honestly, I've never seen a problem with NFT situations, and basically the way NFT works, with that little thin film of water going down a nice elevation, you don't usually have a problem getting oxygen back into the solution. So where you can run out is in flow bed systems, but I just haven't had it seem to happen, so maybe others have that. Normally, if you're worried about that, normally that 4 parts per million is what you're shooting for to make sure you don't go below that. So, but in all the different various designs I've tried, unless I have a very small tank, so, those very small tanks I've seen issues with, so, but that's sort of what I do research-wise, and I sort of know I'm going to have problems. But in those large tanks that may occupy a quarter or half the size of the greenhouse, as long as we have it circulating, maybe 10 to 12 hours a day, I've never seen a problem. So I've also seen it where the beds simply don't circulate. But I would say that's really not the best thing to do. So because you tend to, if you don't circulate it, you can actually get sort of hot spots and cool spots in the solution. You can also sort of I think it's better to mix it around and let it mix up a little bit to make sure you keep all the nutrients in solution. So it also keeps the nutrients mixed around a lot. So because you may end up sort of depleting nutrients on one side and another side. And by keeping that circulation going, you can sort of prevent those little light spots from occurring. Whatever you're using in the flow bed, this is one small one where he's got an NFT system, so in sort of a modified Quonset. He's got sort of he has 6 foot and there's sidewalls on his Quonset hut, so it's really not a Quonset, even though I guess he calls it a Quonset hut. So, but you can see the little slight elevation going down towards the side of the greenhouse here. So he uses a mix. He replaces every other week, and he's got great crops. There's no question about it. NFT is a nice system, especially in terms of cleaning it. It's probably the easiest way because you can periodically inject bleach or some other kind of material, so it's a pretty easy system to clean up. So, and you don't have a lot of problems with algae, which you can really have an algae problem with the flow beds, especially if there's wide gaps or areas where you have like on the edges where it may not be completely sealed. So when you get some water or sunlight directly into that water, you're going to get green algae forming. So you can certainly have some problems with that. So, but whatever material you do use needs to be greenhouse-grade fertilizer. Otherwise, you're not going to be water-soluble, and you're going to have some problems. Greenhouse-grade materials are a little bit more expensive. They're more expensive because they're water-soluble, but that's what you need to use in the case of a NFT or... So typically with lettuce, we're looking at keeping the pH in that 5.6 to 5.8 range. I've seen in the literature people in keeping it upwards of 6.5. And I can't say I got the best growth when I grew my lettuce at 6.5 pH. So I know if you're a young lettuce grower just getting into it, I know the safe range is that 5.6 to the 5.8 range. You may need to adjust the acid or base because most of the times in the system you've got a tank of solution. So if you're not changing it every 2 weeks, you've got to maintain it. So that usually means acidifying it over time, raising the pH rather up a little bit over time. So because it's going to change quite dramatically as the plants grow and as you add water to it to maintain the level in it. EC-wise, like I said, this is I really look at this as a gross measurement. In Alabama, in the summertime, I like to keep the EC closer to 0.5 to 0.6. So, because if I get it much higher than that, I'm going to see tip burn in my lettuce. So, however, in the wintertime, so we'll keep it upwards of 1.5 to 2, a little bit higher. Some growers will go because they feel like they're going to push it. But one thing I've seen is over the years in a research project I did, what I found, and this is actually one of the results of it here. So this is a bib lettuce. So if I kept the pH or the EC much greater than 3, the romaine and the bib lettuce, the leaves actually got leathery. So the appearance actually drastically changed if the EC was too high. So, so a lot of growers like the idea of trying to push the crop, really adding a lot of nutrients as solution. That's really not a good option. So, the science bears it out, showing you can really end up with some real major problems if you do that. So keeping it in these lower side. So, and there's also definitely differences in varieties. So, in terms of their optimal pH, it's almost like looking at kids. Each kid has a varying personality and seems to have some unique things. Some of the oak leaf lettuces that I've grown, they seem even more sensitive to EC changes than the bib lettuce I was growing. So I couldn't quantify everything, but you can certainly see it in terms of the quality of what you were producing. So I spent, either the root system didn't look quite as good or wasn't as big, quite as vigorous looking. So, the plants may not be as large as they should have been. So you can definitely get some interesting differences with that. But this is the typical range that we're shooting for. On the lower side, typically in the summer, and the higher side, typically through the winter crop, through the winter times. And this again, this is what it looks like when I was growing this lettuce at an EC of 4. That's what the lettuce ended up looking like. So basically 2 weeks in the lettuce crop, I started increasing the EC fairly gradually. So, and by the end of 5 weeks, this is what the lettuce started doing. It just stopped growing. It looked pretty rough. The leaves got a little thick and leathery. So there's definitely a high end. So if I had to look at the two crops, the lettuce was a lot more, or the tomatoes were a little bit more tolerant of shifts in the EC. Not that you want to see that, but research-wise, you can see it. So it's not one of those things you want to do as a grower. Smooth and steady is always the better option for growing plants. So, keeping them spoon-feeding the plants, a little bit of fertilizer at a time, keeping them going, is always better than inundating them one day with a lot of fertilizer. And that's what you sort of run into if you do the lettuce, every 2 weeks you replace the nutrient solution. So the nutrient solution, the levels of all those nutrients begin declining, then all of a sudden it goes back up again, so you get a growth spurt. So if you're really trying to get predictable, even growth, that's definitely not the way to go. But if you're a small grower just getting started out, and we have had, like I said, 24 growers just in the last 6 years getting started in lettuce in Alabama, so selling to major metropolitan areas. So, and most of them are doing, they're growing NFT or using float, most of them using float beds, a few of them are using NFT. So, and they're replacing that solution every 2 weeks, and they've just gotten on schedule, and it works really well for them. So, this is the typical formulation that we recommend. This, again, is based on some stuff from the University of Arizona over the years. So there's a lot of premixes out there for lettuce. And so basically what you end up doing for most of the premixes, you'll have like either a 3-15-27 material or something close to that, or a 8-15-36. And you end up using calcium nitrate and magnesium sulfate in addition to it. So 3 primary ingredients, and that's really it. So, and it's been working really well for these guys. And again, like I said, this is some stuff that Merle Jensen had developed over in the 70s and 80s, and we've just found that it really works well. So with the premixed material, those other 2 ingredients, you've got plenty of recipes out there. If you want to try to actually develop one, use one yourself. Again, it's getting the components, that's always sort of the challenge. So then mixing it, making sure you get everything right, mix it up correctly, so you can end up with a pretty decent crop. But for my money, frankly, if I'm just getting into this, I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to try something a little less complicated, and it's going to hopefully have a higher, or have reasonable results at the end that I know is going to work reasonably well. So, but Rick's going to put these talks online, so if you want to see these recipes, the difference in these numbers is just whether you're mixing it up in ounces, pounds, or grams. So it's just the amount of this material you put in per gallon of water for whatever you're doing. So it's pretty straightforward, and I sort of like straightforward. We have a number of growers in terms of other crops that are growing leafy green-wise. The other 2 that are really popular right now in Alabama, Swiss chard and basil. Basil does great in hydroponics, and they're basically using the same solution that we're using for the lettuce. So I'm not going to say it's optimal, but it's not bad. So if you're going to if you're looking for a starting point to do some herbs and other things, but the chefs that our growers have been selling to like the soft, succulent growth that they're getting out of the greenhouse compared to what you get in the field. You know, in the field, the plants get beaten down by the rain. They get a little bit on the woody side, so a little tougher. They don't have all those nice, that nice odor that you really like from basil. So, but in a greenhouse situation, you can get 3 cuttings a week off this stuff. So off basil compared to really one out in the field. So in terms of productivity per square foot, this is really amazing for basil. So it's just 2 other things. And the Swiss chard, if somebody asked me a couple of years ago if I thought there'd be Swiss chard production in Alabama in NFT, I would have said probably not. So, but you know, it's sort of specialized. All the growers that supply Birmingham and Mobile area, they grow some of this stuff. So to supply, they've just found that the chefs love it, that they're selling it to. So if the chefs want it, why not grow it? So, all right. That's 45 minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments or, yeah?
Anybody try to grow kale or collard in there?
Kale works great, actually. So, and actually, if you're going to grow kale, you know, the dinosaur kales and some things like that they're very popular right now. So, and we have guys that are growing kale now in NFT. So it also does okay in the float bed. So with collards, you're not going to make any money growing collards. You know, they grow. I've done it experimentally, and I've seen people do it. It's a really big plant. So quite frankly, and the amount of money, you have to get paid a lot of money for that collard. So it really makes sense, you know, for it to really make sense. But the kale, yeah. So we've got a lot of people who do microgreens for kale, you know, where they just let them get up, you know, not even a week old, and they sell them as basically as a microgreen, just an entire plant. Also mini kale, where they just let the leaves get about this big. They'll sow a real sort of heavy setting of it in flats or in a float bed kind of situation. So, and they'll just mow it off when it just gets a little long. You know, they won't strip individual leaves typically, so they're sort of mowing the whole plant. So yeah, it actually works pretty well. It's just temperature. You just can't do it in the summertime.
How many cuttings do you get off that kale?
Off the kale, I don't know. So, you know, for the guys that do the microgreens, you know, you're selling the whole plant, so you're getting rid of it in the course of like a week. So, but the ones who do the little mini ones, they'll usually get 2 or 3 good cuttings off of planting. So you could probably get more. So, but I've really never tried it. If you're looking for, there's a fellow who spoke last year on microgreens. That was Gary Bachman. So there's a really good book on Amazon. I was talking to somebody earlier about it. It's on growing microgreens. He had recommended. So if you go to Amazon and you type in microgreen growing, there's an awesome book on there. You can tell you everything about microgreens and some mini veggies that you would grow like that. So you can probably get a lot more information from that. So anything else? Yeah.
On that fertigation table where you show the one that was for
Tomatoes?
injector, no, for tomatoes, the one for the injection.
Yeah.
How do we convert this to a tank? How do we convert this?
It's just a math problem. So I had to sit down with a calculator and I can show you how to do it. So
it's a matter of 30 gallons and then you buy that or whatever.
well, in this case, you know, it's set for a 1 in 100 injector, so we correct the rates up there based on that because we wouldn't be diluting the stuff. So it's just a math problem. I'll say I couldn't do it in front of you, but I could sit down and show you on the table what you can do. So, and actually, there's programs out there you can do. You can type in, you know, like on Google Go and say you want to convert that kind of. I'm trying to think of the page I found. It was like Ohio State University's got a lot of greenhouse information on their website, and they have a little thing where you can sort of type in your information, saying this is what I want to end. Basically, this is what I want to end up solution-wise. So when you sort of type in the ingredients, or you can sort of type in this kind of information that I'm using these 3 materials, you know, what do I need to put in my bulk pin? So yeah, I can show you. So basically, or Rick could probably show you. So anything else? All right. Well, thank you.